I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on Russian advances on the battlefield around the town of Kurakhove. A plane crash in Lithuania raises fears of Russian sabotage. And the journalist Inna Varenytsia tells us why civilians in Kherson are now afraid to walk in the park.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 25th of November, 2 years and 280 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today I'm joined by Russia correspondent James Kilner and the Ukrainian journalist Inna Varenytsia. I started with the latest news from the battlefield. Starting at that 12 o'clock point in the north of the front line in Kursk, geolocated footage published on November the 24th, that's yesterday, Sunday, indicates Russian forces have recently advanced on the western side of that main Ukrainian salient in Kursk. The Center for Defense Strategies, Kiev-based think tank, reports the Russians are attempting to capture the village of Darino and the hamlet of Nikolaeva Darino there. But we've also got geolocated footage from a few days earlier, late last week, that shows that Ukrainians have also advanced on the other side of the salient. They've moved northeast of the village of Martinovka, northeast of Sudzha. So a lot of movement going on over there. We absolutely know that the Russians are looking to crush that salient in the next few months. There's a Ukrainian drone operator who tweets under the handle of Krigs, and he has said this morning that in the nearest future we expect a massive and, in my humble opinion, successful Russian advance on my flanking Kursk region. 2 Russian VDV is Russian airborne divisions, 1 VDV brigade, 1 Marine brigade, will launch an assault with a lot of maneuvers. So watching developments there closely. The Ukrainian General Staff said they destroyed an S-400 air defense system radar in Kursk overnight Saturday to Sunday. Russian sources also say that Western long-range missiles, probably ATACMS, were fired at Russian positions in Kursk overnight last night. We're not in a position to confirm that, but we know that the permission's been given. It was not at all an outlandish kind of report. Moving around the front line inside Ukraine, no change in those Russian lodgements just on the Ukrainian side of the border to the north of Kharkiv city. But if we go over to eastern Kharkiv Oblast, to the Kupiansk front, there is some movement there. On Friday, anyone who's listening on Friday will remember me mentioning that very small Russian foothold on the eastern bank of the Oskil River that has effectively cut the Ukrainian bridgehead there in two. The Center for Defense Strategies now reports the Russians are attempting to expand that foothold, which is near a village called Kolesnikivka. They're attacking both north and south along the riverbank there, trying to expand that lodgement, heading north towards Kupiansk city. They're also pushing southwards from the northern side of that salient near Kupiansk, clearly trying to pinch that bridgehead off. So you can see the Russians trying to slowly move in on Kupiansk. Kupiansk, obviously a city liberated by the Ukrainians in the autumn of 2022 during their successful Kharkiv counter-offensive. The Russians have been trying to get back there ever since. Moving down the front line, we do have reports that the Russians have advanced around, these are names that anyone following the front will be familiar with, Borova and Central Terny. Not major changes there, but worth noting. No significant reported changes in the Siversk salient. This is the easternmost Ukrainian-held position on the front line, so it sticks out into Russian-held Ukrainian territory there. Very strategically important for obvious reasons. But I will note, before moving on, that a Russian general was reportedly fired over the weekend for falsely reporting he had achieved breakthroughs here. James Kilner wrote up that story, and he's going to have more on that later. Moving south into Donetsk Oblast and the central fortress area around Kramatorsk, Russian forces continued offensive operations in the Chasiv Yar direction yesterday, Sunday, but didn't advance. They did conduct some offensive operations south of Chasiv Yar near a place called Stupachki. That was over the weekend, Saturday and Sunday. Some suggestions they're trying to bypass the city to the south, but no significant change there. Similarly, further south in Teretsk, we've talked about the battle for that mining town for quite a few weeks. It seems to remain deadlocked in the centre of town. On Friday, of course, some Russian sources were saying we've made an advance and we now control more than 50% of the town, but it still seems locked in a fairly grinding, confused urban battle there. Some reports, the Russians are trying to advance south of that, so they're basically trying to cut east to west through a southern suburb of Toretsk, apparently in a kind of attempt to maybe outflank the trouble they've run into in the centre of town. But again, the Institute for the Study of War reports no confirmed changes to the front line. But now we're getting down to Pokrovsk. This is where things start heating up. So the Pokrovsk area, anyone following the war will be aware that the Russians have been pushing towards Pokrovsk for months. It's a major offensive of their kind of general offensive this year. That advance had stalled for quite a while. They'd seemed to have moved to the south, but we've had a little bit of movement over the weekend. They have pushed up a very narrow kind of advance, and it's kind of pointing straight northwestwards like a needle heading towards Pokrovsk itself. It's shooting up from that broad salient they've established over the past few months. It's got to the center of captured a village called Pustinka, pushed onto the village of Zhovtye, if you want to look that up on Google Maps or wherever. That advance looks like it's covered something just under 3 kilometers. So in the context of this war, not an insignificant movement in 2 days. I also wanted to note the Centre for Defence Strategies assesses that's part of the broader effort to encircle Pokrovsk from the south. And we have seen over recent weeks and months how the emphasis of the Russian offensive in this area has moved towards the south rather than pushing directly on towards the city. And that brings us down to the Kurakhove area, and this is where things really are fluid. So Kurakhove is that town on the banks of a reservoir that was built for a power station, which is basically the Ukrainian anchor in the southeastern corner of the front line. Massive pressure there. So to the north of the reservoir, the Russians are basically attempting to encircle Ukrainian units in the kind of developing pocket near the village of Sontsovka and Besetsky. That potential pocket seems to have diminished in size slightly over the weekend, which may be either a reflection of successful Russian offensive actions or the Ukrainians retreating to avoid encirclement. But that threat is very clearly there. South of the reservoir, that's where Kurakhove itself is. It's kind of town-stroke-village which kind of extends east to west along the bank of that lake. So south of the reservoir, they're continuing to push directly westwards into Kurakhove itself, almost straight out from Donetsk city. There's a highway that drives into Kurakhove. But the real movement is in this very tiny, I'm not even sure what the word is, a kind of bridgehead, a kind of salient, I suppose, to the southeast of Kurakhove. I mentioned this on Friday, that the Ukrainians still held on to that. It's shrunk considerably since then. The Russians have now reached, of the several villages I mentioned on Friday, they've reached the villages of Romanovka and Yelizavetevka and Ilinka. Now, last night it was reported that Ukrainian troops in the next village up, a place called Katarinivka, were under threat of encirclement. It looks like that village may already have fallen. It's not clear to me immediately whether that was captured or the Ukrainians managed to fall back before the Russians put in an assault. But you can see that little area very rapidly beginning to fall under Russian control. And you can see, simply just looking at the map, how the Russians really seem focused on pushing on towards Kurakhove, consolidating their position there. A reminder of the CDS assessment on that, which I read out late last week, which is that before the end of the month, probably the Ukrainians are going to have to retreat from that area to avoid encirclement and try and establish a new line further, I suppose, to the northwest. And that brings us, if we move west, that brings us to the Battle of Velika Novosilka, or what is becoming the Battle of Velika Novosilka. That's the next kind of key anchor town, a kind of district capital in Donbas terms, westwards from Kurakhove. The Russians have really been putting in an effort here. There is a report that they broke through nearly 5 kilometers towards the town's eastern flank over the weekend. We're told minefields hindered progress directly towards Velika Novosilka, and there was a lot of heavy rain, which then impacted maneuverability and drone usage. There was an attack directly towards Velika Novosilka, which was repelled in open fields. That's the general news of the maneuver war. Further, not much news, no significant changes to report further west through Zaporizhia region, down in Kherson along the Dnipro River. But I'll just leave you with this. on the frontline developments. This is from the Institute for the Study of War in today's or yesterday's update. Russian forces' recent confirmed battlefield gains near Vuhledar and Velika Novosilka, that's the area I'm talking about, demonstrate the war in Ukraine is not stalemated. The front line in Donetsk Oblast is becoming increasingly fluid as Russian forces have been advancing at a significantly quicker rate than they did in the entirety of 2023. So, headline there, things are beginning to move. If you thought the front line was frozen, it's really doesn't seem to be especially down there. Quickly on the air war before we go to James for the diplomatic and political updates. Volodymyr Zelensky has just said this morning Russia launched over 150 airstrikes on Ukraine since last night, since Sunday evening. He said they were carried out by strike drones, aerial bombs and missiles targeted 10 Ukrainian regions. The one that's getting a lot of attention this morning, it includes this Russian strike on central Kharkiv, right in the middle of the city. There's photographs going around of a kind of mushroom cloud of smoke rising from, I think, near that central square in Kharkiv. We had at least 19 people injured earlier on today. The title of this Twitter space is 20, and I've just seen the latest figure is at least 23 people injured in that airstrike, probably missile strike, I suppose. And Mr. Zelensky also added that a child was injured in Zaporizhia with a drone attack on Zaporizhia overnight. Odessa was hit by missile fragments. It's not all one way. Ukraine said that they hit last night Rosneft oil refinery in Kaluga, a city south of Moscow. Andrei Kovalenko, Ukrainian spokesman, also said that a factory in Kaluga called the Typhoon plant, which produces communications and guidance systems for Russian missiles, was also hit. And there's videos on social media of kind of black smoke rising over Kaluga, so that seems confirmed. That is pretty much the military situation as of 1 o'clock London time this afternoon. James Kilner, I believe you're there. Could you give us the latest diplomatic, political, non-battlefield updates today?
Sure, Roland. So let's take your listeners and start in Vilnius, where we had a breaking story this morning. About 5 a.m. local time, a DHL cargo plane crashed into a house near Vilnius airport. It was trying to land, apparently, and it crashed into this house. At least one of the 4 crew has been killed. Remarkably, no one on the ground was killed. But the point of this story is that German and British intelligence agencies had warned last month that Russia was allegedly trying to sabotage DHL flights out of Leipzig with small incendiary devices. Now, it's far too early to say what happened in this instance, but German politicians are already saying there needs to be a thorough investigation here because this was a DHL flight out of Leipzig, which crashed on approaching the airport. It's a Boeing 737 with a good track record, etc., and it went down. So there's a lot of speculation flying around this incident. Specifically, DHL flights out of Leipzig, as I said, there were 2 previous small incendiary devices found, one found in the Leipzig depot, one found in Birmingham, which had come on a DHL flight from Leipzig. Now, these 2 devices were also traced back to having originated in Vilnius. So there's a lot going on there. It's too early to really speculate, but you have to join the dots a bit there. And you have to say, in the context of these warnings of the supposed Kremlin hybrid attacks on Europe, etc., this is a very serious moment. So there's a lot of attention on this one story that your listeners should be up to date on. Moving away from there, we had a warning over the weekend from a British minister, Pat McFadden, who's Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, and he warned of a massive, quote, destabilizing, debilitating cyber attack on Britain, which he said would be exceptionally aggressive and reckless and would be targeted at power grids, etc. This comes a few months after an earlier attack on British power systems, which hit a couple of NHS hospital trusts, forced the cancellation of about 800 appointments, etc., and really shows once again how the Kremlin's stepping up these hybrid attacks in Europe. So there's also a link there with the potential DHL crash. So it's an important note of interest for your listeners to be up on. Moving back slightly to Ukraine itself and the battlegrounds there, it was a busy shift over the weekend. I was on Sunday yesterday, and we reported on 2 important stories. So you mentioned it, the sacking of this general, and also the capture of a British soldier in Kursk region of southern Russia. Starting with the general, this guy is called Gennady Anashkin, and he was head of the southern group of Russian army fighting in Ukraine. Like I said, that was his focus was around Seversk. It's an important piece of ground. I think it's about 30 miles north of Bakhmut, but they're fighting over that to defend against Kramatorsk and other bigger cities, Ukrainian cities a bit further back. He was sacked, according to Russian military bloggers, so there was been no official confirmation of his sacking by the Russian Ministry of Defense. He was sacked apparently for faking battlefield reports in this region a month or two back, and also for recklessly throwing unprepared and untrained soldiers into battle. None of this sounds particularly exceptional to me. I've been following this war since the start, and we know the Russians have been exaggerating their battlefield successes. We know they're utterly reckless with how they treat their soldiers, etc. So I don't know quite what has happened here. This guy had only been in command of this particular group of Russian soldiers since May. So it's very difficult to ascertain what happened here. We do know, though, that he was sacked 2 days after Andrei Belousov, or the day after Andrei Belousov, actually. He's the Russian Minister of Defense. He made a rare frontline visit on Friday to see the soldiers in Russian soldiers near the front lines in Donbas. Belousov was made Minister of Defense by Putin in May this year. And he's really an economist, and he was brought into the Ministry of Defense to really integrate the Russian national economy with the military, or the military with the Russian national economy, and to get cost savings out of the whole system, that sort of thing. He's not a military man. He wasn't brought in as a frontline guy who goes down to the front lines and boosts morale or whatever. But on this occasion, on Friday, he did actually put on a military uniform, very rare to see him military uniform. And he did go on a visit to the front line. And he appears to be making some quite serious, for want of another phrase, management decisions around how the Russian army is operating by sacking this one general, etc. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. If there's going to be a slightly different approach in how the Russian military go about their warfare, etc., or he's just trying to get rid of commanders he feels are poorer. He did warn, one Russian military blogger said he did warn commanders that they can make mistakes, but they can't lie. So a word of warning there to his commanders. Overall, these Russian military bloggers were celebrating the sacking of this particular general. They didn't like him. They said he wasn't up to the job, etc. So they were saluting Belousov around that. So an interesting sort of inside Russian army story there to consider. On this former British soldier, video popped up yesterday morning, lasted a few minutes. He was in some sort of room. There was no identification on the room. He said his name was James Anderson. He said he was a former private in the British Army's Signal Regiment, and he'd been fighting for Ukraine since 2023. He said he was in the Kursk region of Russia. That was the bit of Russia that Ukraine captured in August this year, and the Kremlin's really pushed to throw in 50,000 soldiers out that salient now to try and recapture it, including all the North Koreans. The important thing about this story is that, to my knowledge, and I'm very happy to be corrected by you or any of your listeners, but I think he's possibly the only foreign combatant. He's with the Ukraine's international legion. He's been captured inside Russia. So it'd be very interesting to see how they deal with that. There were two other British guys fighting for Ukraine who were captured in April 2022 in Mariupol after the siege of the steelworks there. They were basically given the whole occupied Donetsk treatment, show trial, etc., given capital punishment, which was then chucked out and they were handed back to Ukrainians, but they were tortured, etc. So it'd be interesting to see what the Kremlin actually does, because the Kremlin will have to deal with this directly to a former British soldier who's been caught, or captured rather, fighting for Ukraine in Kursk. Aside from that, I think an enlightening little story is this video that Vladimir Klitschko has released, calling up US podcast host Joe Rogan, who was criticizing Biden for allowing Ukraine to fire Western-made missiles at Russia. This is the story that dominated our coverage last week. Rogan was saying, Biden's been completely reckless. He's about to start World War III, etc., all this sort of stuff. Klitschko pops out. He's the former world champion boxer, not someone you want to mess with. And he popped up and said, "This is completely wrong. You're just repeating Russian propaganda. We need a stronger America." let me onto a podcast and we'll go head to head on this one. The reason I'm highlighting this story is it once again shows the strains which are coming through in US-Ukraine relations and how Trump's election victory is really going to change the dynamics there. So plenty to get our teeth into, Roland.
James, thank you so much. And yes, you mentioned there those two British soldiers captured in Mariupol. That you're talking about Aidan Aslan and Shawn Piner, of course. And I just wanted to flag there, actually. So Shawn Piner, who has been on the podcast, a remarkable guy, has been tweeting very angrily about the coverage of this latest capture because some British outlets have been calling him a mercenary, which of course is it's what the Russians call any foreign combatant. Shawn's point is that if you're enlisted in the Ukrainian army or receiving regular Ukrainian wages, as he was, you're absolutely not a mercenary. You're a perfectly legal combatant. I think that's worth flagging. It's something that we've seen the Russians use to exert kind of psychological pressure on the prisoners themselves in a way. So you're illegal, you shouldn't be here. Shawn's point is, no, it's perfectly legal to be taking part in this war. These are enlisted regular soldiers in the Ukrainian army, and therefore be careful with that kind of terminology. Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to say that Inna has joined us. For those who do not know Inna Varenytsia, she's a very distinguished Ukrainian journalist who I and other Telegraph journalists have been very lucky to work with in Ukraine over the course of the war. Inna, you're in Kyiv. I was wondering, well, I suppose, first of all, how are you? How is Kyiv? What's the atmosphere in the capital right now? I suppose, given all of that hoo-ha last week about nuclear weapons and strategic missile strikes and so on.
Well, previous week was a bit tense, and we definitely felt that Russia is trying to make a psychological pressure on people in Ukraine. And from the other side, we can't take a signs when it become too danger and we should hide being physically in Ukraine. And even some institutions made some precautions here in Kyiv, like in residential block. There was a message that on Friday it's better to not to gather deputies in Ukrainian parliament, so parliament didn't work on Friday. And the streets were more empty than usually here. But now everything works and no other restrictions for work in institutions or wherever. So we achieve that there will be more such a psychological pressure in terms of the event which will happen tomorrow. You know, that Ukraine will discuss with NATO members that case which happened previous week when Russia targeted Dnipro with Rubish missile, a new kind of missile. So maybe there will be more such strikes on Ukraine. But Saturday was completely peaceful and we had time to breathe out. And then today on Monday, we see more strikes on key cities, key regions like Kharkiv, like Odessa. And we see this the Russian strategy just to keep this psychological pressure on people, on government, and trying to interfere in some decisions with this pressure.
Now, I want to ask you, actually, I was messaging another friend in Kyiv just last week who said that day when the US and other embassies started closing their doors was rather stressful. When you see foreign embassies do that, that was a bit of a difficult day, which I suppose says something because Kyiv, it's not easy to frighten Kyiv. It's been through a lot already.
Yes, but from the other side, the sense of humor helps people a lot. We have the deepest metro station in Europe here in Kyiv, which is Arsenalna metro station near the parliament. And Ukrainian people joke to each other that we have some places to hide even from nuclear weapon. But anyway, yes, now everything works, and feeling that everything works help a lot. And also, at the day when Ukrainian parliament didn't work, there was an official visit of Czech representatives from Czech government, and such visits help to keep in mind that it's not so bad and Russia won't be able to destroy all the territory of Ukraine at the moment. So life still goes on.
Thanks for that, Inna. I wanted to ask you a couple of things, really. I know that you were down in Donbas a couple of weeks ago, and you've been down in Kherson as well. But I also wanted to get your reaction to this recent news we just went through. Could you just tell us, what do you make of this news that we've just had about, the Russians are making more gains, the front line is no longer stalemated? Does that fit with your understanding of that? And what do you make of the news from the front at the moment?
Well, I noticed that Russians started to move more actively in the beginning of November when I was on the front line in Donetsk region. Then there was a really bad weather. It was super windy, it was like a storm, and it stopped a bit movements for a few days. But then Russians started to move more intensively. I think they just moved more troops, and also they changed the priorities. Seeing that it's harder to fight back Kursk region, part of Kursk region, they changed strategy. And also, I can't say that everywhere, but partly Ukrainian troops started to build defense line behind Pokrovsk, third and second defense line. But at the same time, Kurakhove is really a weaker place. There were no such good preparations. And also there was some movements on the front line. And it's already a strategy of Russian troops to move at the places where Ukrainian troops are making replacement. And it gave them opportunity to move forward, despite the fact that now it's much harder to move with armored vehicles because there are less and less on Russian side. They lost a lot of armored vehicles. But from the other side, they still have a lot of human forces, people, soldiers, and that's how they move. Another thing that we noticed, that we found out recently, is the problem with ammunition for Ukrainian troops. And we are talking not about quantity, but also about quality. My Ukrainian colleagues already started this discussion because there are some videos provided by Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian soldiers, on which we can see that mortar shells do not fly. They can get stuck in the mortar, in the tube of mortar. There can be a fire in the mortar tube and other technical problems. Or if the mortar shell flies, it can fall down near the mortar. So it happened not only on one position. This problem happened all over the front line in the Donetsk region. And bad quality of ammunition really plays on Russian troops' side.
There's a video actually today. Yulia Kyrienko-Marinova, the journalist, has posted a video, I think, from Pokrovsk, of exactly this, of a soldier, trying to fire a mortar and the shell kind of pops out and flies, I don't know, maybe 20 meters. Is there any information? Is this a particular batch of shells that have come from a particular place? Is there any suggestion of whether this is linked with that, or is it a general kind of deterioration in the quality of ammunition?
More likely it's about quality of ammunition. Maybe it's wet explosive parts of shell. And it's not about storage of these shells. It's more likely about technical problems in production process. And it happened in Pokrovsk, in Kurakhove, so it already happened on many positions. So it seems it's not about delivery, it's not about storage.
Okay. And these are places you just mentioned where the Russians are making significant gains at the moment.
Yeah.
You've been reporting this war since 2014, a long, long time before the full-scale invasion. You were last in Donbas, I think, at the beginning of this month, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you just tell us about what you saw, where you were, your sense of the mood of the troops, the state of Kramatorsk and the areas around it, I suppose?
Well, the moods are different. I was in Chasiv Yar, I was in Kramatorsk, in area which can be third line also. It's, for example, Svetohirsk. And I was surprised that In some areas which are really far from the front line, we can see back position, like third line, which was built recently. There were debates about quality of third line. And I found out that in some cities, third line now is built it was built properly. So those administrations, places which were under occupation, they know that it's better to prevent the occupation than to run away or to deal with it when fightings will start. So we see some preparations further from the front line. As for Pokrovsk, all September there were strikes with glide bombs to Kramatorsk. And it was really unusual for Kramatorsk because this area was not hit with glide bombs. But then October was relatively calm. And since the middle of November, there were some heavy strikes on city, which also shows that Russian troops are trying to keep psychological pressure, because it's still not possible to reach city physically with troops, but it's possible with ammunition. And as for Chasiv Yar, unfortunately, we see that Russian troops are advancing very slowly, but they cross the canal. But there is a brigade which is really experienced. They know the area well, and they have some more brigades who are helping them. So it's not enough to keep the positions for a long time, really long term, but they did, I think, really good job because they stepped on those positions in June. And my forecast was that they could keep the positions like for half of a year. And it looks like they will manage to keep it till New Year or maybe even longer. It depends on supplyment of ammunition, of course, because those brigades do not have enough ammunition. So Russians are slowly moving there. Another situation is in Pokrovsk itself. Now it's not the priority for Russian troops to move in Pokrovsk direction and in Marnograd direction. So they are trying to move quickly in Kurakhove and from Ugledar, because there were no second or third line. So when Ukrainian troops stepped back, they didn't have well-prepared or even prepared line where to hide, how to fight, and so on. Another problem is also about troops which are defending the line. When Ukrainian troops withdraw from Vuhledar, there were mostly the main brigade which defended Vuhledar was retreated from the front line at all. And instead of them, there were new brigades sent to the front line. But some of them belong to territorial defense, and they do not have heavy equipment. They do not have armored vehicles. And also, some of them are newly created. It seems that many of them do not have fighting experience, like real combat experience. And this is a problem. And then, after a week or weeks, paratroopers reinforced territorial defense brigades and new brigades, and the front line stabilized a bit, but still we would see that for Ukrainian troops it will be really hard to keep the line. So we achieve that Russian troops can move in coming week or two with the same speed.
This is this tactic you talked about them targeting places where the Ukrainians are swapping units out of the line. And so to you, that explains this rapid Russian advance in that area around Kurakhove and Vuhledar, this lack of prepared defences and also inexperienced troops, basically.
Yes. So in general, the most dangerous places where we see movements, it's Kurakhove, and if you will look on the map, you will see Kupiansk. Russian troops moved a lot there. They almost surrounded Kupiansk and a few villages there. But as it's a big town, the battle for Kupiansk will be really hard.
Thank you for that, Inna. I want to give James the opportunity to talk to you as well, but I wanted to ask you about your trip to Kherson, because I know you were there recently and you were telling me before we came on air just about how people are afraid to basically go outside in Kherson. Could you tell us about when you were there, what you saw and what is going on down in Kherson, especially because it's a part of the front line that we don't hear that much about these days?
Oh, I haven't been to Kherson like about a year. Previous time I was there a year ago. And for me, I see that the moods changed a lot because people with kids mostly leave city, and people who, mostly elderly people who didn't find a place for them, who didn't find a place, the opportunity to get money, they turned back to their homes. So from one side, I see that there is almost the same quantity of people, but different kind of people, different age of people. But there are still kids. And what surprised me a lot, that Kherson now becomes like a fortress, because from one side, we know that there will be no physical movements in coming months, for sure, because it's a deadlock. There is a river which protects Kherson from physical movement. And from the other side, there will be no development of the city, because the destination, it's only 5 kilometers from Russian troops.
Yeah, it's just they're just across the river, right? They're on the other side of the Dnipro.
Yeah, it's just 5 kilometers from them. And it seems that FPV drones can hit any spot in city, because FPV flies about 25 kilometers. And as Kherson is flatty area itself, it allows to fly sometimes even further if there is a good weather and the equipment allows to do this. I mean, the supportive equipment. So it's a danger for everybody, and there is almost no troops in the city. But civilians are afraid to appear on streets because they can be targeted as well. I think Russian troops are trying to keep the fear on this region, not to allow people to get back. And also they are following any movement close to the bank of Dnipro, because even, I don't know, maybe they achieve that soldiers will be wearing civilian clothes or whatever. But there are many cases when civilians were targeted by FPV drones in the middle of the city, in the center of city, close to Dnipro River. And also Russians sent landmines. They dropped landmines in parks using drones. So they moved the landmines. And now it's a big danger to walk in the city when there are a lot of leaves on the road. And it's very cold in Kyiv now, but Kherson is much warmer. And when I was there in Kherson, the trees were completely yellow. There were a lot of leaves, and I felt real danger to walk, to step on leaves. At the same time, all the institutions, all the services work there really good. For example, I saw people cleaning the streets, but they were wearing body armors. So all the services work in body armors. Also, if the shelling happens, they usually clean the rubbles and protect the windows in 2 or 3 hours, because everybody wants to hide before 3 or before dark, before 3 p.m. even. So after 3 p.m., city looks really empty. And people who are waiting for buses, for example, they're hiding under trees because they don't want to be spotted by drones. So it's a big physical threat.
God. Thank you, Inna, for that. I really appreciate that. I was last with you actually, in Kherson in over a year ago. So thank you for giving us that portrait of life down there on the Dnipro. James, I realise I've been hogging the conversation again. Do you have any questions for Inna?
Hi, Inna. That was really enlightening. Thank you very much. My only question is, I was reporting last week I wrote a story about Zelensky's soft changing language since Trump won that US presidential election earlier in November. And in that story, I quoted an Economist poll, which said that 52% of respondents to their poll now wanted to negotiate an end to the war. This is Ukrainian respondents, up from 27% at the same time last year. What's your view on that sort of poll? Do you agree with that? Do you get a sense of that shift or not?
Well, for me, it's really hard to agree or disagree, because when the war goes on, it's really hard to make good research. Ukrainian analysts and sociologists say that it's hardly possible. So from the other side, what I see is that giving such messages to media from governmental side, it's like a test to see if the society will agree or disagree. And we discussed this a lot with colleagues and with friends and with regular Ukrainians, that it's not only about wish of Ukrainians to start negotiations, but it's about the head of the country which fights against Ukraine, Vladimir Putin. So the negotiations will start, and readiness for negotiation, it's not only on Ukrainians and their wishes. And it's a very complicated situation, because in general, Ukrainians can fight more successful against Russian troops. But Western support usually comes too late, and then Ukrainian troops need more Western aid and another kind of aid. So I can't say that I can agree with this survey.
And now, a different kind of dispatch from The Telegraph's Francis Dearnley, who's been travelling in Ukraine.
Normally, the last thing you'd want to hear about is what somebody's watching late at night on their hotel television. But I hope you'll let me off, because the last time I was in Ukraine, I channel hopped to get a sense of what was on offer. And I remember many people seemed really interested in this, so I thought I'd do it again. And it's an interesting exercise in cultural differences, as well as just getting a sense of the tone of the kind of programming in a country at war. Switching the TV on now. The first channel is a 24-hour news channel. In the bottom right, a candle. And that candle marks the fact that today is Holodomor Remembrance Day, of course, the mass starvation that took place during the Soviet period, which caused the deaths of millions of Ukrainian men, women, and children. The channel is currently showing footage of commemorations around the country. President Zelensky is, as I speak, laying a wreath on a stone memorial in Kyiv. And now it is hopping to the studio, where they are interviewing some talking heads around the country in various different places. So some of them are soldiers, some of them look like government officials, and they are evidently reflecting on the day's events. Interestingly, on the other news channel that I was watching earlier on, it was a long-form interview, not dissimilar to what we do on Ukraine the Latest, half an hour, just speaking to one guest in detail, just in the studio, with no cutaways, nothing trying to be overly dramatic, just an interesting conversation. It's sad that we don't have that on mainstream TV in Britain. But let's go forward to the next channel next. Okay, so it's showing Lethal Weapon 2. Don't ask how I'm so familiar with this film. It's rather an ironic title given the circumstances that there was an air raid siren not so long ago. Right, so the next channel is currently showing adverts. There's a man who's in a wheelchair, and then he is now jet skiing, but he's got artificial limbs. It's quite a common subject matter. Okay, it's showing the next advert for the next program. It seems to be a kind of police drama, typical escapism. Lots of people in interrogation cells, but but they all look rather too glamorous for the jobs that they have. Okay, and then we've got the program after that being advertised, and this looks like a very serious interview documentary program. It's got currently 2 ladies who are crying and then showing pictures of men. I think it's got something, I'm guessing, to do with men who are either away at war or who have been killed. Let's go to the next channel. Okay, the next channel is also adverts. It looks like underwear modelling. Right, I'm just looking out for Dom Nichols. No sign of him yet. Okay, and now it's showing skincare products. Let's go to the next one. It's another news channel. This one too has the candle in the bottom right corner, making reference to the Holodomor Remembrance Day. And now there is a clip showing of a man we know very well on Ukraine the Latest, General Bogdanov, and a quotation from him. He looks a bit fiercer than when I met him 7 months ago. I should add that there are some people who speculate he too, like General Zaluzhny, might be one day a presidential candidate. Let's go to the next channel. The next channel is another American show. God, I haven't seen this guy for years. It's the bloke who plays, what's his name in Buffy? Angel, is it? That guy. Ooh, this one looks quite interesting. So we've got 2 ladies who are on a sofa and they're chatting to each other. This also looks like it's a kind of drama. Looks like this is Ukrainian made. And they are, she's putting a ring on her finger. Looks like they're reenacting some kind of romantic previous thing that's happened. She looks pretty chuffed, but one of the friends is skeptical. Maybe she's not impressed with the offer that the other lady received in some other circumstance. I don't know. I haven't got a clue what's going on, to be honest, as you can probably tell. Right, and now we're getting into the dubbed foreign channels. So there's Comedy Central, but again, it has the Holodomor candle in the corner. Then there's a music channel. Dua Lipa is currently singing, looking glamorous as ever. Oh, crikey, there's some nude people on the screen. Right, we'll skip that. Okay. Oh, I know what this is. This is the really weird American version of Sherlock Holmes where Watson is played by Lucy Liu. Got nothing against that, but I just find it rather weird seeing Sherlock Holmes outside of London. I think he's in New York City. But anyway, that's currently on. Then we have come to a history channel by the looks of it. Can see, looks like this was filmed in the 1980s and okay. This is a documentary about the Holodomor. So I'm looking currently now at black and white images of corpse-like people on the street who are evidently starving. And then there's a historian explaining the images that are appearing on the screen. He's got lots of books behind him. He's also wearing some rather fetching braces. And the subsequent channel is also showing a documentary about that terrible event in Ukrainian history, something that many would describe as being a pivotal, unifying event that brought the country together once the revelations of the atrocities that had been committed came out after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'd recognise that moustache anywhere. So the next channel is showing what appears to be some kind of documentary about the foremost Ukrainian poet, another foundational figure in Ukrainian identity. That's enough entertainment for one evening. I think I'm going to return to my book. Night all.
Thank you, Francis. We're just about out of time, so without further ado, I'd like to go to final thoughts. James Kilner, what is your final thought today?
Well, Roland, I think it's about this reported ATACMS strike, the first one since Putin unveiled this new missile and gave this very thinly veiled warning to the US and Britain about Ukraine firing their missiles into Russia. So Russian Telegram channels are now saying that Ukraine fired 5 of these ATACMS US-made missiles into Russia on Saturday evening. Apparently it hit a missile defense base, and killed 4 Russian soldiers. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the response is there. Yeah, that's what I'll be looking out for.
Thank you, James. Inna, as our guest, what would you like to leave our listeners with this week?
My feeling is that Ukraine is still open question, and there are still opportunities to get better position for Ukraine and Europe as well. So there is no fatigue, there is no depression, but readiness to do something. And thank you for understanding and interested in this situation.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. And as ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter, executive producers Louisa Wells and David Knowles.